You're going to learn in this case a lot about what it means to be a public servant and to have the honor of wearing this badge. It's a small badge that carries with it a large responsibility and a large accountability to the public. What does it stand for? It represents the very motto of the Minneapolis Police Department: to protect with courage, to serve with compassion. So let's begin by focusing then on what we will learn about this 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And you will be able to hear Mr. Floyd saying, "Please, I can't breathe. Please, man, please." In this 9 minutes and 29 seconds, you will see that as Mr. Floyd is handcuffed there on the ground, he is verbalizing 27 times, you will hear, in the 4 minutes and 45 seconds, "I can't breathe. Please, I can't breathe." You will see that Mr. Chauvin is kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck and back. He has one knee on his neck, and the knee on his back is intermittently off and on his back, as you will be able to see for yourself in the video footage. So we learn here that Mr. Floyd at some point is completely passed out. Mr. Chauvin continues on as he had, knee on the neck, knee on the back. You'll see he does not let up and he does not get up. For the remaining, as you can see, 3 minutes and 51 seconds. During this period of time, you will learn that Mr. Chauvin is told that they can't even find the pulse of Mr. Floyd. You learn he's told that twice. They can't even find the pulse. You will see that the paramedics have taken the gurney out of the ambulance, have rolled it over next to the body of Mr. Floyd, and you'll be able to see Mr. Chauvin still does not let up, doesn't get up. You're going to learn in this case quite a lot about the Minneapolis Police Department's use of force policy. What you're going to see and learn a lot about is what is the standard for applying force against individuals, the use of force policy. You learn that Minneapolis Police Department employees shall only use the amount of force that is objectively reasonable in light of the facts and circumstances. The force used shall be consistent with current Minneapolis Police Department training. What you learn, ladies and gentlemen, is that the use of force must be evaluated from one moment to the next moment, from moment to moment. What may be reasonable in the first minute may not be reasonable in the second minute, the fourth minute, or the 9th minute and 29 seconds. That it has to be evaluated from moment to moment. You'll also learn that the Minneapolis police are precluded, not allowed, to use any more force than is necessary to bring a person under their control. They can't use any more restraint than is necessary. You're going to meet an expert. His name is Jody Steger. He's a Los Angeles Police Department sergeant and a use of force expert. He's going to tell you that the force that Mr. Chauvin was using was lethal force. You're going to hear from Minneapolis Police Sergeant David Pleague, who's going to come and talk with you. He was the officer on the scene, so he arrived at the scene after this took place. He is going to tell you that the force against Mr. Floyd should have ended as soon as they put him on the ground. You're also going to learn about another very important policy in the Minneapolis Police Department that's a core principle of policing. You will hear this phrase that police have to live by in terms of how it is they relate to the public. In your custody is in your care. In your custody is in your care. Meaning that if you as an officer have an individual, a subject that's in your custody, it is your duty to care for that person. And you will learn that caring, ladies and gentlemen, is not a feeling. It's a verb. It's something you're supposed to do to provide care for that person. You are going to hear from any number of police officers who will talk about this duty to provide care. And you'll be able to see for yourself that when Mr. Floyd was in distress, Mr. Chauvin wouldn't help him, didn't help him. But you're also going to see that he stopped anybody else from being able to help him. You will learn that amongst the bystanders was a first responder, a member of the Minneapolis Fire Department, who was trained in administering first aid and emergency care. She's going to come and talk with you. Her name is Genevieve Hansen. She wanted to check his pulse. She wanted to check on Mr. Floyd's well-being. She wanted him to let up and get up. She did her best to intervene, to be able to act, to intercede on George Floyd's behalf, and you'll be able to see for yourself when she approached Mr. Chauvin on top of George Floyd with both of his knees, reached for his mace in his belt and pointed in her direction. That Mr. Chauvin's last day of employment with the Minneapolis Police Department was on May 26th of 2020. The Minneapolis Chief of Police, Chief Arredondo, is going to come here to talk with you. He was the police chief at the time. He's the chief today. He is going to tell you that Mr. Chauvin's conduct was not consistent with Minneapolis Police Department training, was not consistent with Minneapolis Police Department policy, was not reflective of the Minneapolis Police Department. He will not mince any words. He's very clear. He'll be very decisive that this was excessive force. You'll also learn, ladies and gentlemen, that George Floyd struggled with an opioid addiction. He struggled with it for years. You will learn that he did not die from a drug overdose. He did not die from an opioid overdose. Why? Because you'll be able to look at the video footage and you see he looks absolutely nothing like a person who would die from an opioid overdose. You will learn that opioids are tranquilizers. And when a person dies from an opioid overdose, what do they look like? First and foremost, asleep, in a stupor. We're going to ask at the end of this case that you find Mr. Chauvin guilty for his excessive use of force against George Floyd that was an assault that contributed to taking his life, and for engaging in eminently dangerous behavior, putting the knee on the neck, the knee on the back for 9 minutes and 29 seconds without regard for Mr. Floyd's life. We're going to ask that you find him guilty of murder in the second degree, murder in the third degree, and second degree manslaughter.
Common sense tells you that there are always two sides to a story. Common sense tells us that we need to examine the totality of the circumstances to determine the meaning of evidence and how it can be applied to the questions of reasonableness of actions and reactions. In other words, common sense is the application of sound judgment based upon a reasoned analysis. And that's what this case is ultimately about. It's about the evidence in this case. The evidence that you will see in this case during this trial. It is, I agree with counsel for the state, it is nothing more than that. There is no political or social cause in this courtroom. And in the end, you will hear a term throughout, I believe, this case called the Bates stamp number. The Bates stamp system is a way for lawyers to keep track of the case, to make sure that we are working from the same set of documents, the same set of evidence, to preserve the integrity of the investigation. You will learn that we are approaching 50,000 Bates stamped items. So this case is clearly more than about 9 minutes and 29 seconds. So how do we begin to analyze and organize this evidence? I suggest that you let common sense and reason guide you. I propose that every witness you will hear from and every piece of evidence that you will see or hear during this trial can be assigned to one of four basic locations: Cup Foods, the Mercedes-Benz, Squad 320, and Hennepin County Medical Center. So let's start at the first, Cup Foods. You will learn that on May 25th, 2020, shortly after 7 o'clock p.m., Mr. Floyd and his friend Maurice Hall entered the Cup Foods located at 38th in Chicago. While they were there, they ran into their other friend, or Mr. Floyd's ex-girlfriend, Shawanda Hill, and he offered her a ride. You will hear from Chris Martin, who is the store clerk at Cup Foods. Mr. Martin observed Mr. Floyd. He watched his body language. He interacted with Mr. Floyd in this moment, and Mr. Martin formed the opinion that Mr. Floyd was under the influence of something. you will see the actual video from inside Cup Foods. Mr. Floyd did use a counterfeit $20 bill to purchase a pack of cigarettes. During this trial, you will hear evidence of what happened in the Mercedes-Benz in the 20 to 30 minutes prior to the police arriving. You will hear from Mr. Floyd's friends, Shawanda Hill and Maurice Hall. This will include evidence that while they were in the car, Mr. Floyd consumed what were thought to be 2 Percocet pills. Mr. Floyd's friends will explain that Mr. Floyd fell asleep in the car and that they couldn't wake him up, that they kept trying to wake him up to get going, that they thought the police might be coming because now the store was coming out, and they kept trying to wake him up. And in fact, one of these friends called her daughter, Miss Hill, Shawanda Hill, called her daughter, Shakira Prince, to come and pick her up because they couldn't keep Mr. Floyd awake. During the course of this trial, you will see and hear the body-worn cameras of these officers that fully capture the entire interaction with Mr. Floyd and his friends. You will see Officer Lane draw his service weapon after Mr. Floyd failed several times to respond to his commands to show him his hands. You will learn that that is an acceptable police practice. You will see the officers struggle with Mr. Floyd to get him out of the Mercedes-Benz and handcuffed. And you will see and hear everything that these officers and Mr. Floyd say to each other. You will see surveillance videos near Squad 320 from a local business called the Dragon Walk that capture the actions and reactions of everyone present at that location, including evidence of further concealment of controlled substances. During the course of the investigation, 2 search warrants were executed on the Mercedes-Benz. The first on May 27th of 2020, the second several months later on December 9th of 2020. BCA agents located various pieces of evidence during both of these searches, including 2 pills that later analysis by the BCA revealed to be a mixture of methamphetamine and fentanyl. This is what's called a speedball, a mixture of an opiate and a stimulant. You will learn that these pills were manufactured to have the appearance of Percocet. While standing next to the Mercedes-Benz, Officer King and Officer Lane both asked Mr. Floyd what he was on. And he says he is on nothing. Upon their arrival, the first thing that Officer Chauvin sees is Officers King and Lane struggling with Mr. Floyd. Mr. Chauvin asked the officers, "Is he under arrest?" "Yes." And then Officer Chauvin began to assist them in their efforts to get him into the squad car. You will see that 3 Minneapolis police officers could not overcome the strength of Mr. Floyd. Mr. Chauvin stands 5'9", 140 pounds. Mr. Floyd is 6'3", weighs 223 pounds. You will learn that because of this intersection at 38th and Chicago is considered a high crime area, the city installs what's called the Milestone Video System. It's a camera that sits high atop a pole and can surveil the entire intersection. When you see these videos pulled back from afar, you will be able to see the Minneapolis police squad car rocking back and forth during this struggle. So much so that it catches the attention of the 911 dispatcher, Jenna Scurry. This was not an easy struggle. And you will see and hear them continue to struggle with Mr. Floyd as he's attempting to kick. You will see and hear that a crowd begins to develop, watching and recording officers, initially fairly passive. As the situation went on, the crowd began to grow angry. But here's what you will also see and hear. You will see and hear the conversation between the officers behind the squad car The crowd is not aware of what they are saying and doing. As the crowd grew in size, seemingly so too did their anger. And remember, there's more to the scene than just what the officers see in front of them. There are people behind them. There are people across the street. There are cars stopping, people yelling. There is a growing crowd and what officers perceive to be a threat. They're called names. You heard them this morning. A fucking bum. They're screaming at him, causing the officers to divert their attention from the care of Mr. Floyd to the threat that was growing in front of them. And you will learn that Derek Chauvin did exactly what he had been trained to do over the course of his 19-year career. The use of force is not attractive, but it is a necessary component of policing. The evidence will again demonstrate that the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension conducted 2 searches of Squad 320. You will learn that in the second search of Squad 320, agents recovered several pieces of partially dissolved pills. You will learn that these pills were again analyzed, were again shown to be consistent or similar to the pills found on the Mercedes-Benz, in that they contained methamphetamine and traces of fentanyl. Moreover, these pills contained the DNA and saliva of George Floyd. The evidence will show that officers made 2 calls for emergency help. Those calls were within 1 minute and 30 seconds of each other. You will learn that paramedics arrived on scene at 8:27 and 18 seconds, just 19 minutes after Officers King and Lane arrived, within 6 minutes of it being called a Code 3, and they did what they refer to as a load and go because of the crowd. They came, they picked up rather than attempting to resuscitate him or treat him on the scene, they loaded him into the ambulance and they drove to a location several blocks away to begin their resuscitative efforts. And you will hear and learn that Officer Thomas Lane accompanied them for part of that time. And some of this evidence is extremely important to the final determination of Mr. Floyd's cause of death. The medical findings include things such as the blood gas test that was taken at HCMC that revealed Mr. Floyd had an exceptionally high level of carbon dioxide. Dr. Baker found none of what are referred to as the telltale signs of asphyxiation. And the state was not satisfied with Dr. Baker's work. And so they have contracted with numerous physicians to contradict Dr. Baker's findings. And this will ultimately be another significant battle in this trial. What was Mr. Floyd's actual cause of death? The evidence will show that Mr. Floyd died of a cardiac arrhythmia that occurred as a result of hypertension, his coronary disease, the ingestion of methamphetamine and fentanyl, and the adrenaline flowing through his body, all of which acted to further compromise an already compromised heart. But when you review the actual evidence, and when you hear the law and apply reason and common sense, there will only be one just verdict, and that is to find Mr. Chauvin not guilty.